Thanks everybody for spending the evening with me, and just give you a little tour of Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument, and I'll talk about some interesting plants, and we'll just have a casual, fun evening here. Okay, so yeah, as Mark mentioned, 25 years ago in September, President Clinton established the Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument using his authority under the Antiquities Act. It was controversial at the time, partly because it was such a large area, it's about 2 million acres, making it one of the largest national monuments, at least in the lower 48 states. It was interesting too at the time. The Grand Staircase was it was mostly Bureau of Land Management land, BLM land, and it was kept under BLM management. Many national monuments often get transferred to the National Park Service. But Secretary Babbitt at the time felt it was important that the Bureau of Land Management take on management of these what became part of the National Conservation Land System. These special areas as part of its regular business. BLM has a long history of managing kind of the lands in the West that nobody wanted. It's the biggest land management agency in the United States, one of the lesser known ones. But many of the properties managed by BLM are places that are too arid to farm. Basically, they were too rough to homestead, and so these lands are often used for other purposes: mining, timber, grazing, etc., recreation nowadays. But President Clinton recognized the significance of this area and set it aside. And then, back up, the Grand Staircase is located in southeastern Utah. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here it is down in southern Utah. It's adjacent to several other park lands, Glen Canyon National Recreation Area to the east, Capitol Reef National Park to the northeast, Bryce Canyon National Park borders it as well. And the southeastern corner of Utah has basically the densest concentration of national park and monument lands in the lower 48 states, and one of the densest concentrations of protected areas really in the whole world. So it's kind of a remarkable area. I don't have to tell anybody that though if you visited the area, because it's quite a spectacular place. The original boundary in 1996, like I mentioned, was about 2 million acres. The monument consists of 3 main subdivisions: the Grand Staircase area at the west end, the Escalante Canyons in the northeast, and then the Kalparowits Plateau in the center. Fortunately, no one decided to name it the Grand Staircase Kalparowits Escalante National Monument. Quite the In 2017, President Trump reduced the size of the Grand Staircase, as well as the Bears Ears National Monument that President Obama had just established a few months before, reduced them in size by about 40 to 50%. And the map in the upper corner shows the adjusted boundaries, and that was the status quo until just this past October, when President Biden restored both the Bears Ears and the Grand Staircase to their original boundaries. In the proclamation establishing Grand Staircase, President Clinton mentioned really 4 main primary values of the monument. One of which being its geologic wonders. Charles Dutton, who was a famous geologist in the 19th century, is the person who coined the term Grand Staircase, kind of referring to the series of mesas that you can see from the Kaibab Plateau in Arizona. Basically, it's the Colorado uplift of sedimentary material, and it's kind of sliced obliquely. Imagine like a layer cake, sort of sliced obliquely, so you can see these rising stair-like escarpments of different geologic outcrops of different ages. They have different colors, and so you get the chocolate cliffs at the base, the red vermilion cliffs like around Kanab, the white cliffs of the white Navajo sandstone, the gray cliffs, the pink cliffs up around Bryce Canyon. And so it's exposing 225 million years of strata in one area. So it's really quite remarkable and quite picturesque country. The second and probably the most significant value for most of the public would be the paleontological resources, all the dinosaurs that are there, and other things as well. And Grand Staircase in the Cretaceous was located along the western shore, around about here, of this interior seaway that split North America into two halves, basically going from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. And that seaway, it was marine water, kind of expanded and contracted over time. And Grand Staircase was located along the coast, and so it was receiving different kinds of sediment depending on the depth or the location of the seaway. And so it was a really significant area for deposition of basically dead organisms, big dead dinosaurs. They would wash down, get covered by mud in a anaerobic environment so that their bones would be preserved and encapsulated as fossils. The area, the Kalparowits area in particular, has extensive fossil beds of dinosaurs from the Cretaceous period, as well as other interesting organisms. There's fossils of these marine lizard-like things, the pliosaurs, sharks, giant crocodiles, turtles, early mammals. Actually not known to a lot of folks is really the significance of the area for plant fossils as well, particularly of angiosperms from the Cretaceous, the era when the angiosperms are really, the flowering plants are really radiating. And so these fossils are really an important source of information for trying to figure out the relationships between different groups of plants. And the plant fossils are interesting too, in that by studying the leaf shape, paleoecologists can infer what the climate was like in this area. And they think the closest modern analog would be like the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, an area that was much wetter, much hotter, much more humid than we're used to today in southern Utah. The third main value was the archaeological and human history components in the Grand Staircase area. And my archaeologist colleagues have suggested there may be as many as 100,000 archaeological sites scattered around the 2 million acres. And they think they've probably identified or studied, at most 1 or 2% of those. So, there's just artifacts of, pictographs, artifacts, broken pots, pit houses, I mean, all sorts of evidence of long-term human use of the area scattered all over the place. And I'm really terrible at finding like arrowheads and stuff, even though I'm looking down to ground all the time hunting plants, but even I can see these things. They're just ubiquitous. The oldest known inhabitations are about 8,000 BC in age, but most of the archaeological sites in the Grand Staircase area are from around 200 BC to about 1300 AD. 1300 is a real important period in the Southwest. It was the start of about a century-long drought that really had a significant impact on the cultures present in the area, which were mostly the Virgin, Anasazi, and the Baptist folks. And so by the time the Mormon pioneers came in about the 1860s, a lot of the evidence of Native American occupation of the land wasn't as obvious as it probably would have been a few hundred years before, but still. They've left a really lasting impact on the land. Part of the value of the Grand Staircase area too is preserving the pioneer heritage as well. And then, from our perspective, maybe the most important value would be the sort of the biological, the ecology values of the area. The Grand Staircase has a real rich flora and fauna. It's really it's an outstanding area for bee diversity, it turns out. I mean, several hundred species of bees that nobody really realized before. And part of the rationale for preserving such a large area was to create sort of this outdoor laboratory, as Jane Belknap wrote, for studying these large-scale ecological processes, where it's really difficult to do that in the contemporary world, where so much land has been altered by us. It's rare to have such a large area where researchers can study and ask really large-scale ecological questions. But I'm going to focus more on the plants of the Grand Staircase for this talk, and the the monument flora is relatively large, and it's been growing as we've discovered, as people get out on the ground and discover more things. When the monument was established, there were about 756 plant species that had been known from the area. When I say known from the area, I mean documented by scientists. About. I don't mean to imply that no plants were known before white people came. There's certainly a lot of knowledge of the plant base by the Native Americans. Sadly, a lot of information that oral tradition of information has been lost. A lot of it wasn't recorded. And so, when I talk about this discovery of species, I'm really talking about from a scientific perspective and really recording those species for long-term posterity. Interesting, about a year after the monument was established, Leila Shultz, who I saw is on the call, hello Leila, gave a talk about the biogeography of the area, plant geography, and she predicted that the flora would have about 1,100 taxa. When I use taxa, I'm referring to full species and subspecies. And her prediction is borne out to be largely true. We're not quite at 1,100 yet, but we're getting there. Since 1996, almost 250 new species have been found in Grand Staircase, bringing the total number of species known, vascular plant species I'm referring to just over 1,000, 1,003 so far. That's actually, these numbers are about 10 years old, so there may be more species by now, but those are the ones that I've gotten on my various lists. There's about 100 or 200 more species that are known from just outside the Grand Staircase that many of those will eventually be discovered. I think Leila's going to win her. I don't know if she put any money on it, but she probably should. The 1,000 plants in the Grand Staircase represent about a quarter of the known flora in the state of Utah, even though the Grand Staircase only covers about 4% of the whole state area. And about 46% of the plants in the Grand Staircase represents about 46% of the entire flora of the Colorado Plateau ecoregion, including the Four Corners area. Here's my one data slide. I'll apologize in advance, just to show you how Grand Staircase-Escalante National Monument compares with other parklands in Utah. Zion National Park has the most species with 1,086 and growing. Grand Staircase is second at 1,003, and then, well, you can read the rest. But there is a pattern in these parks where the parks tend to have more species, which not really a surprise. Species area relationship, and some of the very small parks, of course, have really relatively small floors. The one park that's missing on here is the Bears Ears, which, as far as I know, has not had a species list done yet. Although it would be an outstanding project for somebody to do. My hunch is that Bears Ears come out pretty high once it's really thoroughly studied. When you look at Grand Staircase compared to other parks, it's most similar in its flora to Capitol Reef. They share the most species in common, and it's not really a surprise since they are adjacent to each other and have some of the similar kinds of environments. The Grand Canyon flora is quite similar as well. Zion's comes in as like the third most similar. So there's a relationship between the proximity of these areas as well. As far as taxonomic diversity goes, using the taxonomic, the families of Stan Welch's Utah flora, there's 85 plant families known in the Grand Staircase out of 128 in Utah. That number of families is different if you use, sort of the more modern APG3, classification, but taxonomists are always going to debate over what the family relationship. Interesting is about 75% of the whole flora is represented by just 16 families, and the 6 largest ones are shown here. The biggest family would be the Asteraceae, the sunflower family, has most species, followed by the grass family, and then after that's the legumes, the Fabaceae. Oops, jumped ahead. Other big families would be the mustards, Brassicaceae, the Scrophulariaceae in its sort of traditional sense. Although the scrophs now are very small, most of the species have been pulled out into the Plantagenaceae or the Orobanchaceae. The Plantagenaceae, mostly like the penstemons and that would still be a pretty big family though. And then the Polygonaceae, the sixth biggest family. There's 380 genera in the Grand Staircase flora out of about 940 in the whole state. So it's a nice cross section. And just looking at growth forms, the most common growth form are perennial, herbaceous species. Half the species fall into that somewhat non-scientific category. Desert floras in general tend to have a lot of annual species, and that is true in the Grand Staircase as well. 20% of all the species are annual herbaceous flora. It has relatively low species richness of trees and shrubs, even though they have such an outsized significance as far as ecological indicators. Relatively few tree or shrub species, about 14% of the flora. And ferns really are underrepresented. It's not even 1% of the whole flora made up of ferns and their relatives. So I want to talk about, why exactly, is the flora so varied, and why is it that there's some, and just talk about some examples of interesting, rare, and unusual plants, and just throw out a few examples of different pictures. One of the big genera in the monument is penstemon, which 21 different penstemon species. Penstemons are a lot of fun, and they're actually not that hard to identify. If you have flowers, if you have the anthers and everything, and see what the glandularity or hairiness is. If you have fruit, it's a little bit trickier, but it's a great place to see penstemons in the Grand Staircase. A lot of different cacti there. Here's an example of the cholla, Whipple's cholla, Cylindropuntia, Whipplei. And there's about 10 species of Enothera as well. And then, part of the reason there's so many species is there's just a lot of diversity of vegetation. And there's been over 100 different vegetation types described in the area. And there's some overall patterns as you go from low elevation up into higher elevation. And the diversity of geologic types also has a big influence on the vegetation patterns. But in a nutshell, the higher elevations, there's montane forests, Douglas fir kind of forest, things you might see in Bryce Canyon or high elevation in Zion. Kind of the middle elevations, extensive areas of pinyon pine, Colorado pinyon, pine sedulous, and Utah juniper woodlands. A little bit lower, you tend to get a lot of sagebrush communities, Artemisia tridentata, and other species dominating, where you get exposures of bare sandstone in particular. There's kind of a slick rock sandstone vegetation types. Lower down, you get the desert shrublands dominated by Atriplex, Jadscale, things like that, and also desert grasslands. These kind of habitats are the ones that have probably been the most altered by human activity, particularly livestock grazing. And then, some of the more important ecologically rich or species-rich habitats in the desert are various wetlands. Hanging gardens, there's riparian vegetation along permanent streams and around springs and seeps. Part of the diversity of species is also due to introduced plants, non-native species, and about 100 non-native species have been documented in the Grand Staircase. About 10% of the flora, which actually is a little bit lower than sort of the statewide average of introduced species, which is closer to about 13%. Not all the weeds are bad. Many weeds are actually rare. It's always sort of seems like a rare weed, but many of them actually are fairly uncommon. But there are some weeds that are pretty ubiquitous and can really alter the landscape in a bad way. Some of these you'll be well familiar with: Russian olive, annuals, red brome, cheatgrass. A real common weedy species actually around Kanab actually is the horehound, Marubium vulgare, which I believe actually the pioneers brought on purpose. Back in the day, folks would use as a member of the mint family as sort of a cough syrup kind of thing, had medicinal uses, kind of fell out of favor, but might be something that an enterprising person could develop an industry collecting horehound to make into medicine or and solve the problem of its if it's spread as well. It'd be nice if somebody could do the same for cheatgrass and some of these other things too. And a big part of the diversity of the area comes from plants that are endemic. And endemism just refers to an area where species occur. When we talk about endemism, we often mean species that are only found in a fairly limited area. And so local endemics might only be known from, say, Kane County or Garfield County or southern Utah, a relatively limited geographic area, certainly within the whole world. There are 43 different plant species that are pretty much only found at Grand Staircase or the immediate vicinity, which is a fairly high number. Most of these are associated with unusual geologic formations, which is a good way to hunt for them. It's not a bad idea if you're a plant hunter to be a reasonably good geologist as well. And most of these endemics, I'm probably fair to say all of them probably, are what are called neo-endemics, and that they're relatively recent evolutionary origin, as opposed to what biogeographers refer to as paleo-endemics, or more ancient endemics, things like ginkgo or redwood that were formerly widespread based on their fossil record, but now found very limited geographic areas. So they've their range has kind of collapsed. Versus these neo-endemics, which have kind of evolved in place and haven't had a chance to really spread yet. Here's an example of a couple local endemics. Both of these, well, they're obviously growing together. The white flower is Enothera cespitosa barstellae, a species named by Stan Welsh for his wife, Stella, which is sweet of Stan to do. He actually named a lepidium for his wife as well. And Lescarella, or now Physaria cumulosa, the little yellow flowered mustard. These occur on this kind of gypsiferous Carmel formation that's found around Cannonville. Very barren kind of areas. Often, the more barren the site, the more interesting it can be botanically. There may not be a lot of species there, but those species are going to be interesting. There are quite a few rare species in the Grand Staircase area. 3 of them are federally listed. I think they're all still listed. There have been some delistings recently. One of them is orchid diluvialis, which is a spring species, a member of the orchid family. There's also Cyclodenia jonesii, and actually the Lescarella tumulus I just showed is listed as endangered. There's about 15 species that are on the BLM sensitive list for the state of Utah, and there's at least 84 rare species on the Utah Native Plant Society rare plant list, at least based on the most recent version of that. That was done by Jason Alexander in 2016. That kind of updated the list that I started in 2012. So it's a real hotspot for rare species. And so, part of the reason there's so many species in the area is because of the location. It's kind of like real estate, location. So the Grand Staircase shown in the red star there is within the Colorado Plateau, which has a lot of species richness. It's also very close to the Wasatch Plateau, shown in the map here, it's number 18, which is really the southern extension of the Rocky Mountains down into southern Utah. And then over here is number 17, the Mojave flora. There's just a little bit of influence of that coming up through the Virgin River into the Kanab area. And so that accounts for a little bit of species richness as well. Colorado Plateau is really one of the most important areas for plant endemism in the western US, particularly in the Intermountain area, between the Sierras and the Rocky Mountains. Lots of speciation going on, particularly with all the different and all told, there's about 18% of the Grand Staircase flora are species that are only found in the Colorado Plateau. A few examples here. These are mostly common species. Of course, the Persia stansberryana, the cliff rose at the upper right corner, roundleaf buffalo berry, or Shepherdea rotundifolia in the center, which is actually a plateau endemic. And then the kind of oddly named Rus trilobata variety simplicifolia. So it's the three-lobed sumac with simple leaves. Kind of confusing. That's another plateau endemic, although quite common. The Dixie Corridor area, and that's kind of that Mojave extension I mentioned. Dixie Corridor, I think, was coined by Noel Holmgren in Intermountain Flora in the first volume, which is an excellent overview of the ecology of the area, if anyone's interested in learning more. But it's sort of this area that skirts the southern part of the Grand Staircase, and you know, there's sort of a passageway for these sort of Mojave species, but then there's also a whole bunch of species that are local endemics in that area as well, particularly on the kind of the Moenkopi or gypsum kind of soils, the Kinley and some other outcrops I'll talk about in a moment. This is mostly low elevation desert shrub, sagebrush kind of vegetation. And one of the signature plants of this area is this breadroot, cane breadroot down the bottom corner, Pediumellum epipsilum, which you wouldn't be mistaken to think you're looking at. I mean, you might think it's a lupin based on the leaves, but it's a different genus in the pea family. The breadroots are real interesting because they have these very large roots that are very starchy, and I don't know about this particular species, but other breadroots were an important source of food for the indigenous cultures. The Buckskin Mountain area, which is really at the very southern end of the Grand Staircase monument near the Arizona border, is interesting because it's really the only place that has a lot of limestone in the area. And for any plant hunters out there, you know, limestone, desert limestone, that's always a great place to go hunting for interesting species, because you know, limestone has there's just always a lot of interesting plants associated with it. So in many respects, there's more limestone heading down towards the Grand Canyon, and so you get some species coming in from Arizona that it's really otherwise barely get into. For example, this little buckwheat down the bottom corner, Eriogonum derovii, which is a little annual buckwheat. Buckwheat's a big genus. 29 species in the Grand Staircase, making it one of the bigger genera. Many of them are shrubs or more perennial herbs. This one's kind of unusual, being so small. It was first discovered in the Grand Staircase area before it was a monument in the 70s, and then I relocated it around 2004 or so, probably the same place. It's around this limestone quarry, and that's actually its size. That's my thumb. It's a regulation size thumb holding it. And some other kind of cool plants, fern bush, Canabatiaria millefolium. That's one of the places where it grows naturally. It's actually a great garden plant. I think I maybe took that photo from my yard in Kanab, but there's a lot of cool plants associated with that area. Then the Wasatch Plateau, you know, this high country kind of area, it's bringing in some different species that are more montane kind of species, things that you would find at higher elevation, like in Bryce Canyon or upper elevations in Zion. And then there's some interesting endemics that come over as well. There's quite a few actually Zion species that show up in Lickwash, which is canyon in the Staircase portion of the monument, where Pete Leska and I found a whole bunch of new species for the monument about 15 years ago, including Canaan daisy, which otherwise was only really known from Zion. Other Pediumellum, Pediumellum pariense, it's kind of a cool one, real low growing plant. That's a fairly big root again, although you wouldn't get a whole lot of caloric value from eating it. They're fairly small. Interesting plant though. You look at these white stripes on the leaf. Looks like a three-leaf clover. It's actually all made up of hairs, and the rest of the leaf is glabrous. But the white pattern, it looks like veins, and they are veins, of course. But there's these white hairs growing along the veins. It's quite striking. Really a cool plant. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just talk about the different interesting geologic formations and the cool plants associated with them. Chinle is a good example. There's a lot of Chinle exposed around Kanab. It's the gray and purple clay. It's kind of a shrink swell clay. People kind of bemoan if they buy a house in Kanab, they want to make sure it's not built on chinley, because if it is, it's going to expand and contract and crack your foundation, which isn't a great thing. But the chinley flora is really interesting, because it's a difficult habitat for plants to grow in. There's some unusual species associated with it. One of them is this little white-flowered chia, Salvia columbari variety, Argillacea, which looks a bit like the typical purple-flowered Salvia columbari, but it's white-flowered and only found on the chinley in Grand Staircase and then over by Zion. Likewise, Astragalus ampullarius is also found in Zion and the chinley in Grand Staircase. One of many different Astragalus. There's 44 different Astragalus species. It's the biggest genus in the monument. Tropic Shale is one of the younger formations in the Grand Staircase. It goes here and there. It's similar to the Mango Shale in Utah. It was a deep marine deposit, clay. It was laid down in fairly deep oceanic water, now exposed. Has a whole host of endemic species, many of which are annuals. Kind of an interesting one, Cymopterus higgins, they're named for Larry Higgins, now put in the genus, or now put in the species Cymopterus glomerata. Some people don't recognize it, which is unfortunate because it's quite distinct. Really should be recognized as a separate variety, at least, or species. Has purple flowers, kind of unusual fruit. A whole bunch of different facilias in there. It's interesting, Euphorbia nephrodemia is kind of restricted to the Tropic Shale. And one of my favorites, Figuera soliceps, this little yellow flowered annual mini sunflower. And in wet springs, there's probably many millions of them growing along the Cottonwood Road. And in a dry year, you'll be lucky to find 5 of them. It really varies in size, in abundance. The Moen copies, particularly where there's gypsum exposed, has all kinds of cool plants, many endemics, like this little Phacelia placella, the beautiful Phacelia, named for this variety, named for Dwayne Atwood, who's an expert on Phacelias. A lot of interesting lichen species, biological soil crust species, and one, a fairly rare one, Gypsoplaca macrophylla. And then the Navajo, you get these, either the sandstone, lots of interesting species associated with sands that are found just restricted to Grand Staircase or practically. One name for Kanab, Kanab yucca canadensis. There's several different astragali. Penstemon moss, one of my favorites. This is actually one of my favorite photos of all time. You can see a little bee zooming in to land on it. This is on the sandy dune on top of First Point up Johnson Canyon. We took the Penstemon Society there a few years back. Lots of cool plants on the Navajo. Hanging gardens are really an interesting area, a habitat. Very few of them in the desert, and they're really of critical importance for wildlife as a source of water. That's the limiting factor in the desert. These hanging gardens usually show up in kind of an alcove, shady alcove, and at the center of a porous sandstone, usually the Navajo, where it joins a clay layer, the Kayenta or its equivalents. And basically water can diffuse readily through the sandstone. It seems like an oxymoron, but it's kind of like a sand sponge in a way. But once it hits those clay layers, it can't continue to move through the rock. So it ends up going out the surface, and often forms kind of a line. And where this water is exposed, water is a magic ingredient for plant life, and if it's shady enough, you'll get perennial growth of plant species, and really kind of a specialized community associated with those hanging gardens. A couple species you might find in that situation are columbine, Aquilegia micrantha, this white-flowered columbine, and an uncommon species, the giant helleboran orchid Epipactis gigantea. About some of the plant collectors in in the Grand Staircase area, and some of the species they discovered or had named after them. And really one of the first plant collectors in the area was Ellen Powell Thompson. You might recognize the name Powell. She was the sister of John Wesley Powell, the explorer. And she was married to his right-hand man, Almon Thompson, who they were doing mapping of the Escalante River and vicinity in 1872. And she hung out in the Three Lakes area north of Kanab. She was possibly the only Gentile woman at that time in southern Utah. So she had a lot of free time to explore. And she was a real good amateur for novelty and collected things. And things came back to her, I think, from the Powell party as well. There's a whole bunch of species that she sent off to experts at Harvard at the Ray Herbarium, particularly Cyrano Watson, that described a whole bunch of species in her name and for her. So there's several things named Thompsoni, Eriogonum thompsoni, the yellow-flowered herbaceous buckwheat that's common around Kanab, Pteria thompsoni, which is this thing that looks a lot like an Astragalus, but has spiny stipules. You have to be careful as you grab it, but they're fairly sharp. That one has a type locality around Kanab. And one of the biggest big blue flowers, relatively small, cushion plant form, make great rock garden plants. There's these real interesting leaves with these scale-like hairs on them. So Thompson, we don't really know how much, or if at all, she did collect on the Grand Staircase, simply because the monument boundaries weren't known then, and folks didn't really know where they were all the time. But she was an important collector in southern Utah. And she actually later, when she left, became an important figure in the suffrage movement for women's voting rights. Before we started, I think somebody mentioned Marcus E. Jones, who was really the first prominent botanist to explore Utah thoroughly. He made the very first scientific collection that I'm aware of in what would become the Grand Staircase in 1890. He didn't do a lot of collecting otherwise within the monument. He mostly worked other areas and really across the West. He's quite a prolific botanist. He had a modern view of species, and so unlike many of his contemporaries who tended to be splitters, their names haven't persisted. Jones' names have really stood up, and he named about 700 species, really from all over the place. Had a few species named for him. This interesting plant, Cyclodenia jonesii, one of our listed threatened species in the Apocynaceae family. Real weird thing. It grows on these barren shale slopes that are very steep, covered with rocks. It's a real hazard to explore for this plant because you're walking on a 45-degree angle on marbles, basically, or ball bearings. It's had a heterotheca name for him, a whole bunch of other things. Kind of notorious. Had his own journal and described a lot of his own things, and he didn't really get along with some of his peers. And he lived a long time, so he kind of outlived a lot of his contemporaries, and was sort of famous for writing rather scathing obituaries for people. He coined the term bug hole botanist, describing, actually, I think it was Rydberg, who was regarded as a pretty nice guy, a good scientist, a little bit of a splitter, but he called him a bug hole botanist because he named new species based on the number of bug holes in the leaves of the specimen. But maybe it wasn't the nicest thing to say. An interesting collector, although he didn't collect a lot on the Grand Staircase, but mentioning is Rupert Barnaby and his partner Dwight Ripley, who traveled extensively in the West in the 30s through the 50s, all over the place, and had like a station wagon or something on these dirt roads out in the middle of nowhere, and they just had an incredible eye for new species. And Barnaby was affiliated with the New York Botanical Garden, and he's an expert on astragalus and Fabaceae, and he and Ripley, they get to all these different weird places and find all these new species. And they had a really remarkable trip in on the Cottonwood Road in 1966, where they in one day they discovered 3 new species, all rare, all new to science. Vigora soliceps, which I mentioned previously, was discovered that day, that fateful day in April. The Euphorbia nephrodemia, and then the Lestrella tumulosa. So that was one heck of a day of exploring. Some other folks from the New York Botanical Garden did a lot of early work in the what would become the Grand Staircase as part of kind of field work for determining what species include in the flora. Cronquist was one of the Cronquist who really arguably the most important American botanist of the 20th century, a real giant, literally. In the taxonomic world, some of his concepts have not stood the test of time, but he was quite influential in his era, and was a co-author of the Flora of the Northwest, Pacific Northwest with Hitchcock, and then also with the Intermountain Flora. And at the time, some of his colleagues back when they were young botanists, Noel Holmgren, Jim Reveal, and others got paid to travel around in the mid 60s, just collecting plants in the Grand Staircase. I mean, what a great way to spend the summer. They found quite a few new species. They were focusing on unusual things and quite a number of cool plants. So I'll just mention the Holmgrens and Reveal and Cronquist and others, really were influential in seeing the Intermountain Flora project to its completion. And I would argue the multi-volume Intermountain Flora with illustrations of everything and keys and full synonymy and everything. It's one of the more important botanical references.
Hey, well, let me just mention that Noel Holmgren is on the call.
Oh, okay. Hi, Noel. I need to mention some BYU folks as well. Of course, Stan Welsh and Dwayne Atwood. They really collected the lion's share of species that we know from the Grand Staircase, at least 430 and more, starting in the mid 60s and really continuing into the early 2000s. Shortly after the monument was established, they got a grant to develop a catalog of species and do some collecting, look for new species, and they've discovered at least 16 new species for science, from Grand Staircase, never before named. And they have some species named for them. There's a Asclepias welshii named for Stan, which interestingly enough has not been found on the Grand Staircase yet. It's known from the coral pink sand dunes and some sand dunes near the wave, both of which are outside of the monument boundaries. Seems like there's sand dune habitat where it could occur. So something to keep your eye out for. Dwayne Atwood, who expert on the Dinosaur, discovered all sorts of species. One was named for him, the Camasonia atwoodii, or Lismia atwoodii now. It's purple flowered. Camasonia, usually they're yellow. It's this beautiful thing. It's in the Smoky Mountain area of Grand Staircase. So they really had outsized influence on flora of the area. I want to mention one other group of BYU collectors that preceded Welsh and Atwood. That'd be Walter Cottam and his associates. Cottam was really the first Utah-born botanist of great stature. He was born in St. George, actually, in the 1880s. Grew up on a farm and a ranch back when St. George was out in the middle of nowhere, kind of. And graduated from BYU. Actually got a doctorate from the University of Chicago. Was very influential ecologist. The intro to Chicago, they weren't initially to grad school because the admission folks had never heard of Brigham Young University, but he was able to talk his way in or so. But he did a lot of early work in the Grand Staircase area during the late 20s, and with some of his colleagues who were actually zoologists, Beck and Tanner, and another botanist, Bertrand Harrison. And they documented close to 250 species for the Grand Staircase. A lot of them were fairly common species. And of course, the monument didn't exist yet. And maybe if they knew it did, they would have looked for more diversity of species. But they were doing a lot of ecological work and some real baseline sampling for wildlife species. I think Cottom's, well, Cottom did a lot of great things. He later went to the University of Utah, helped establish Red Butte Garden. One of the most important contributions to the science was a lecture he gave in 1947. It's pretty famous. It's been published as a booklet. Is Utah Sahara bound? And where he detailed in great precision, the impacts to the landscape in Utah caused at that point by about a century of human use, basically looking at the impact of grazing activity on the state and how it was contributing to what we would call today desertification. And he was, this was based, Cottom was a ranch kid. He had set up plots all over the place in Utah, on the Forest Service lands and sort of BLM lands. He knew what he was talking about, and he had the the scientific data to support it. But he was widely attacked for questioning, kind of the sacred cow of agriculture. And folks, actually they tried to get him fired from the university, and fortunately the college president, stood up for him, and Cottom was able to retire many years later as a widely regarded professor. And he really was kind of ahead of his time in some ways in identifying issues about range management that we're still kind of grappling with. That sort of segues into some of the work that I was involved in, back when I worked in the Grand Staircase, so gosh, almost 20 years ago now, where we were looking at kind of following in Cottom's footsteps in some respects, using a BLM manual to assess conditions of rangeland health, with the notion really being to identify different types and different specific areas within the monument that needed more management attention versus those that were in good functioning condition. The whole idea of coming up with a kind of a more ecologically sound basis for grazing management. So one of the things that happened with Grand Staircase that not everybody realizes, in the proclamation, is grazing use was essentially grandfathered in. I mean, there was some discussion of how it might be modified, but in the original proclamation, grazing was the issue of grazing was sort of sidestepped for a later analysis that I contributed to, as well as many other colleagues. And so we did this 4-year project where we're looking at examples from all the different habitat types on the monument, both upland and wetland sites. Here's just a map showing those 1,100 samples using this rangeland monitoring method developed by the Bureau. And so a very, very thorough coverage. And I would argue we've probably done more of this rangeland health assessment on Grand Staircase than any other BLM unit that I'm aware of in the West. And came up with some real interesting discoveries. Basically, the idea was to identify those sites and habitats that were properly functioning, shown in green here, and those that were actually they're in yellow, it's up in the legend, sites that were functioning but had some issues where we might want to modify management to make sure that these areas don't become worse off, where they're no longer basically retaining soil, holding water, having the proper biological species present. And then there were relatively small were not functioning according to these rangeland health standards. These sites tended to be low elevation areas, former desert grassland, sagebrush areas, seedings, places that received pretty high use by fairly concentrated use by livestock. A lot of the areas that actually came out ranking well are pinyon juniper areas or higher elevation areas where there just wasn't much livestock use. And likewise, we looked at riparian areas as well, streams and springs, and found some similar results. One thing about riparian areas is with a little bit of help, they do come back. Water is the secret ingredient, and if we stop taking the water away, the vegetation runs relatively quickly. Take points from our work. I just wanted to finish with just a couple other slides, though. Maybe finish on a little higher note. There's still a lot of cool things to be found in the Grand Staircase. Still a lot of species to be found. We're still 100 short to meet Leela's list, or her prediction. And one of the fun things we've done after I left the Grand Staircase was in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and more recently the Grand Canyon Trust is do these kind of bio-blitz exercises where we get a group of sort of experts on different organisms together, as well as citizen scientists and local landowners to spend a weekend trying to identify all the different species that are present. And one that we did in the Deer Creek area near Boulder, I was involved in 3 of these, and perhaps there's been some more around 2009, 2010. We got groups together and really had a great time, and all the different, birds, small mammals, lichens, bryophytes, vascular plants, ecological communities, all kinds of cool stuff. And it was really a great way to collaborate with people you don't always interact with. And we discovered some interesting things too. For example, my one claim to fame in ecology is Keith Shultz from the Nature Conservancy and we came up with a new vegetation type, this shown here in the lower left. The dark gray areas on the Navajo Slick Rock, this interesting Bigelow's sagebrush blue grama community, which shows up fairly consistently where there's a lot of lava boulders top of Navajo. So that's actually a type in the national vegetation. We found some rare plants. Lepidium montanum variety Leesii was new to the area, and lots of cool animals and birds and other good stuff. And I think some more of these have been done elsewhere. I think in the Johnson Canyon area as well. I want to close with a few other thoughts. There are species still to be found too that are known historically. One's illustrated here, the Paria iris, known only from the type specimen, collected in 1976. It was named as a new species by Stan Welsh, Iris pariense. Closest relative appears to be a northwestern species, Iris tenax, which I know here in Washington. Down along the Paria River, hasn't been seen, since then. Is it still there? What's going on? Was it, introduced? Was it really tenax or something? It's, there's still these mysteries of these, and certainly new plants to be found. One thing I want to stress too is, the monument was rescued, if you will. The boundaries have been put back, but there's still threats to the area, and hopefully a situation where every 4 to 8 years, the boundary gets altered, depending on what political group is in charge. But I would put forth that a real challenge that remains and was present when I was working there 20 years ago and still going to be an issue for many years to come is trying to integrate sort of the local and traditional knowledge and values. And that comes from native cultures, comes from white settlers, farmers and ranchers, and to kind of integrate that with things that we understand about the biological values as ecologists and botanists and scientists, sort of the Walter Coddams of the world, and try to reach some kind of consensus on really what are the best practices to move forward and to use those practices in guiding management. I felt when I was working there, we had an opportunity to do that through the Rangeland Health assessments. We had teams of people, there was always a botanist or ecologist working with a range conservationist, a soil person. And, out in the field, you have conversations over lunch. You learn about each other. You learn about, trusting each other and different perspectives. And, some might call it the Stockholm syndrome, but I think, we talk to each other, we learn from each other. And I think when we were working on that project, I came to an understanding of other points of view. I think the folks I worked with got to understand where I was coming from. And I thought, we really had an opportunity to use that common set of knowledge common values, if you will, to sort of move forward. Unfortunately, in reality, that didn't happen for many reasons I won't go into. But I think especially in this current era where everything's so polarized, folks, we're all siloed, we don't talk to one another. It's so important to have those conversations, to find that common ground, and because without it, we really can't move forward. So that's my final thought. Thank you for listening, and if we have time, I'd be happy to take any questions.